My guest on this podcast is Paul Collier, somebody who's taken the concept of creative strategies and 10x that concept by taking on portfolios of properties and controlling them rather than purchasing them necessarily. He's been brokering deals and he's done hundreds and hundreds of property deals over the years. He not only explains a concept on how to find these type of properties, but which type of seller will allow you to structure these type of deals, what you need to say to them to get this to work in order for you to be able to do the same thing. So let's jump straight into the podcast. Paul, many people that tend to think about getting started in property hear about this idea of controlling property without purchasing, and you've been amazing at 10xing the concept. Rather than just trying to take one property and trying to acquire it on without necessarily purchasing, how do you do that with portfolios and large portfolios? And you've done some really impressive deals. We were just speaking off camera before about one that's going on at the moment down the south, a £6 million purchase where there's £27,000 of income is generating, about £17,000 of cash flow, I think you mentioned.
That's right.
Profit essentially each month on that, and very little money that's gone into compared to the value of the portfolio. So we'll unpack those bigger deals. Let's start with, how does the concept work about controlling property, and maybe talk us through an example of something on a kind of more smaller level to help people understand, and then we'll talk about the bigger deals and how to get into them and how they work.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely, Sarge. So let's talk about the concept of controlling property. And I think, if I go back probably a few years now, probably one of the best deals from an emotive point of view, which was a control deal. It wasn't the biggest deal ever, but it was an absolutely fantastic deal. I've been in to see a lovely little old couple who were looking to sell their 4-bedroom house in the Midlands. And they had tried it on the market, couldn't sell it traditionally. They wanted the top dollar for it. They didn't want to take any discount. They didn't really want to do anything creative. They were not at all interested in doing lease options or whatever you might want to call them at the time. And I never, ever try and push a square peg into a round hole. So after explaining everything, going through everything with them, I said to them, look, really, the best thing you can do, I think, is to stick with trying to sell it through an agent. However, I'll give you a few tips, I'll give you a little bit of help, and that's what I tried to do. Kept in touch with them for 6 months, 8 months. Nothing really came of it, and I think I then stopped and thought, well, put that one down to experience, didn't come off. A year later, I got a call from the lady and asked me if I remembered her, and she went on to say that things had changed in their life. Unfortunately, the husband, who was in his 70s, he developed cancer, which is very sad. They couldn't handle this big 4-bedroom house anymore. They'd gone to the council and they'd been able to find a little bungalow quite local to them, but they had to take it quickly. It was a very limited time. So they had to move. Now, what then happened was, of course, I went back to see them. I said I could absolutely help them. Now, for me, Sarge, this was a great property. It was an ideal place for an HMO. I wasn't going to turn it into, I wasn't going to change the structure of it because I was doing it on an auction. Yeah. But I was able to make some good cash flow from this property. So I wanted to do the deal. And what they really wanted more than anything else when I went through it with them was that they wanted some monthly cash flow so they could be comfortable. Now, it was mortgage free, so it had nothing on it at all. And I did a deal with them over 5 years with a 2-year renewal period. So in that period of time, I would control the property as if it was mine. So effectively, I stand in their shoes legally. I take over all responsibility for bills, repairs, maintenance, and everything else. And of course, I have the right now to buy it. I don't have the obligation to buy it. So that's the deal. And we would fix the price at what was then the current market value. Yeah. So that really achieved their goal of not having to discount it.
Yeah. So, and what they were asking was probably at the top end.
It was. Yes. It was at the top end of what was reasonable. It was kind of what I'm going to call an estate agency price. Yeah. And we all know what that is. Yeah. It's the real price plus a few percent. And so I really wanted to do this deal, but I had a bit of a concern. Now, the concern was, of course, they were both elderly. And when you are doing a deal such as a lease option or any form of creative deal that relies on time, of course, one of the concerns is that the person that you go into the deal with, no matter how good the relationship, no matter how good the rapport, you may not be going through that relationship at the end with the same person.
Yes. So when it comes to you completing on the contract, the people may have changed. Situation may have changed.
Situation may have changed. It could be one's demise.
Mhm.
It could be both a demise. So for me, it's always very important that I then address the issue of what if. And it's the kind of the elephant in the room that a lot of people don't want to talk about.
Yes.
So ultimately, it's that conversation that says, how do I ask someone, about how they feel, what's going to happen when you die?
Yeah.
Well, it's actually quite an easy conversation, right? You just simply say, now, by the way, let me just ask you something. Do you know what would happen if I were to die or if I were to demise?
Mhm.
Oh, no, please tell me. Well, I explain that. That opens the door
Yes.
for me to then ask them, oh, by the way,
Mhm.
let's flip that on its head. What would happen if you demised?
Mm.
So it's not kind of pointed, particularly when you're dealing with somebody, A, who's elderly, and B, who's just been told they've got a terminal illness. You've got to be very, very delicate. And so we went through all of that, and I asked the question, who it would be, who would be the family that would go to. It was the daughter. She only had a daughter. She was 18 years of age. So I asked if the daughter could be included in the next meeting. And this young lady came along. She sat in on the meeting. I explained to her in detail exactly what it would mean. And by the way, just for anybody that's watching that doesn't know what that might mean or how that might look, the agreement properly written by a proper solicitor will survive demise.
Yes.
And the benefit of I still retain the control, but when I come to buy it or sell it, the benefit will go to the demise estate, as per their will, as per their estate manager.
Yeah.
But this is the big thing. I had to make the daughter a bit aware that she would be bound by those same rules.
Mhm.
And she was happy with that.
Yeah.
So we went ahead and we did a deal. And it was great for me because it was a really good cash flowing property. Now, I was paying £500 a month.
Okay.
But because there was no mortgage, all of that £500 came off the purchase price.
Mhm.
So effectively, really, I wasn't really paying anything for it. The tenants were helping me buy it.
Yes. It was like you were paying installments towards the purchase price.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So we had that for 5 years. And fortunately, the old chap, Dennis, was still with us.
Yes.
They were quite happy where they were.
Yeah.
And so it came to the review time.
Yeah.
So we met and asked them what they'd like to do.
Yes.
And she said, well, you know what? She said, Mr. Collier, we'd really like it if you carried on doing what you're doing now and paying us the £500 a month. We find that really helpful. We don't want that to stop. So I agreed to it. I actually agreed a bit of a modification to it, by the way. I said, I'll do it, but from now forward, for the next 2 years, it will not come off the purchase price because I was happy.
Yes.
Right? I was making great money.
Yeah.
I'd already built up a pot. I didn't want to take the last bit out of the deal.
Yes.
So they were happy. I was happy. 18 months later, unfortunately, Dennis demised.
Okay.
And I got the call. I went round to see them. Now, the daughter had since emigrated to France.
Right.
So she travelled back from France, now a woman,
Yeah.
25, with her husband. And we sat down and we went through things. And I said, look, what would you like to do? And she said, we'd like it sold. So I tidied it up. I moved the tenants out. I got it really nice.
Okay.
Put it on the open market.
So I just want to go back a couple of steps on a couple of things before we talk about the daughter. So I guess somebody hearing this concept for the first time, and it was certainly the case for me, a lot of things going in my mind are, why on earth would somebody agree to something like that in the first place? So, for example, why would they not just rent it out? Why would they have this arrangement with you when they could have just become a landlord?
It's a really good question. And it's something that comes up all the time. And we'll come to that in a little bit more detail on one of the other deals. The answer is, who knows? That's the real answer. The answer is, I realized a long time ago that trying to second guess what somebody else's situation is just doesn't work.
Yes.
Because I had no idea. So now I actually use that in what I do.
Yes.
And it's a very powerful thing. Now, in their case, they had to move quickly. They had been trying to sell it for a long time through agents. It wasn't working.
Yes.
Most people don't know any other way. They only know that they put it on with an agent. Where do they go? What do they do? Their need and their concern was they wanted to get into this small property so
Mhm.
that life became easy for however much.
That was their priority
That
at
was
that
their
moment.
priority. That's what they wanted. They also wanted the best possible price for the property, which
Yeah.
was going to be their daughter's legacy.
Yes. So in their minds, the case of we don't want to accept less than this figure. So there's no flexibility on the end price.
Correct. There was no flexibility on the end price. They certainly did not want to sell to a BMV buyer. Because they saw that would be taking money out of their daughter's pocket.
Yes.
So it wasn't so much for them, it was more for their daughter.
Yes.
From their perspective, they also needed to move quickly because they had a very, very limited time to accept this property. Otherwise, they lost it. And I was able to give them that certainty. So it was speed, it was certainty, it was giving them the full price.
Yes.
Even though they didn't get the money now.
Yes.
And it was a fact they were also going to get £500 worth of monthly cash, which, let's be honest, for an older couple like that on a pension is a very substantial sum of money, which they were very happy to accept. So that's why.
You've heard the phrase, your network is your net worth, and you'll also hear it in this particular podcast as well. That's because people in property recognize the importance of being connected with other people. Property is a people business, and that's the reason I've been running a networking event for over a decade now. Each and every month we bring like-minded people together, an opportunity for you to come along and meet some of those people and also learn from other people on the stage, learn from myself as well. So make sure you book onto the next meeting. We're on the third Tuesday of every month in Birmingham. Now let's get back to the podcast. So I think in a situation like the kind of the key messages is really trying to understand the seller's situation, circumstances, and for your proposal to be, it's really tailored to their situation. That's what you're doing. It's not, well, look here, let's just do this. It's understanding that and then coming up with a solution that's going to work for them and give them what they want.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So, so the daughters come back from France. They want the property sold.
They want the property sold. I had agents around to look at it, got a price on it. I was ready to go and put it on the market. And then one day I get a call from the daughter out of the blue. And she said, look, Paul, apropos, absolutely nothing to do with the property.
Yes.
I wonder whether you can help me. My husband and I, we're in relatively low paid jobs. We found work. The husband was working in a supermarket.
Because they moved back to the UK.
Because they moved back to the UK to be with mum now.
Okay.
I should have mentioned. Yeah, thank you. So now they're back. And she said, we are struggling. We cannot find anywhere to live. Rentals are very high. We can't afford to buy a property because deposits are too much and we're only getting a little box. Is there anything you've got or anything you could do? And I said to Samantha, I said, can I ask you a question? I said, and it's not a loaded question. Please feel free to say yes or no. Would you consider moving back into your family home that you grew up in with mum and dad? And she said, well, yeah, but I couldn't do that, Paul. It's a big 4-bedroom house. We can't afford that sort of thing.
Yes.
So I said, supposing you could. Now, Sarge, on this one, I was going to make between £30,000 and £40,000 on selling that property. So I went away and thought about it, and I went back to her and I said, how about if you could cover £30,000 or £40,000 for me and cover my profit? Is that something do you think might be achievable? And by the way, let me put you in touch with my broker who has got some really, really good experience and will be able to help you. Well, my broker was able to put together a family mortgage, which was a particular kind of mortgage whereby they allow, a daughter, a son, or what have you to buy a property at a much reduced price. And she got it. So she got the loan and I got paid.
Yes.
So she now, with her husband, was able to move into a 4-bedroom house. One of the nicest things ever for me was, and I can see myself back there right now. And this was one of the nicest deals I ever did. Not the most profitable, one of the nicest. I remember going round to hand over the keys and it was 6 o'clock at night. She'd finished work and we're outside the property and I've got the keys and I just needed to get a final signature on a contract. And then I realised it had to be witnessed. And I hadn't got anybody there.
Okay.
So I said to Samantha, I said, do you happen to know the neighbours next door? She said, I don't know, Paul, 7 years ago. I've got no idea. So we knocked at the neighbour and it's a little Italian lady who came out. And I asked her the question. I said, do you remember Mr. and Mrs. Smith next door? Well, of course I do. They were my great friends. I said, do you remember their daughter Samantha? Oh, Samantha, yes. I said, here she is.
Yes.
So they're a woman of 25. There was tears, there was cuddles. I'll tell you, I was nearly crying, right? Honestly.
Yeah.
And I said, by the way, can I introduce you to your new neighbour?
Yes.
Oh, wow. I mean, that was amazing. So essentially, we got them out of a hole.
Yes.
They were able to move into their property. They'd have £500 a month for that time, for the best part of 7 years, 6.5 years, which helped them. They got the full price in the end, but they gave it to their daughter. So we babysat, effectively, we babysat the property by taking control of it and not owning it. And then effectively at the end, we were able to say, there we are, having babysat the property, put new carpets in, refreshed it, brought it all back up for you. By the way, there it is for your daughter. I mean, wow. Yeah. I mean, it don't happen like that every day, don't get me wrong. Right?
Well,
but
I
that
think
was absolutely phenomenal.
A key sort of message for me in that is that at each stage you're trying to resolve problems. You're looking at, right, how can I find a solution to this situation? And that's serving them, that's helping them. But at the same time, you're making a profit as well in that process. And they're delighted about the process and the outcome you've been able to achieve for them.
That's right. So when we, I think it's a much overhyped phrase sometimes, win-win-win. But it really is a win-win-win when you've got that. Everybody is happy. Couldn't have done that in any other way. Their options were that they lost the property and stayed there and struggled, or they sold the property,
lose the bungalow,
that they were going to move into, or they sold the property at a substantial discount, which would have come out of their daughter's inheritance. So it was great.
Yes. Yeah. So this concept of controlling property, option, lease option, assisted sales, vendor, finance, partner, but whatever sort of terms that we use, we bundle into this box of creativity. I guess it's probably less than 2 decades that it's been around in the UK. So how did you get involved in this? What's been your journey and background into doing these type of properties and then doing it on a much bigger scale, which we'll talk about in a few moments?
I'm a lucky guy, right? So luck has to come into it somewhere. And I'm a great believer in, whenever there's a cloud, it does have a silver lining. You just have to make sure you're on the right side of it. So I had a number of businesses over years. I was in the distribution industry. I was in the motor trade originally. I then got into the distribution industry, and I had a distribution business, which is why I moved to the Midlands.
Okay.
I'm a Southern boy originally, and I moved to the Midlands about 20 years ago because I was central.
Right.
Yeah, I was living out the suitcase, traveling all over the country. So I was central, and I decided I was going to get into property. I went to a couple of property seminars at the time. I had another house, by the way, but I wasn't really serious.
Yeah.
And
accidental investment.
Yeah. And I had, unfortunately, and I shall mention no names, but there were lots of people closing in on me, trying to close the deal. I remember a guy coming up to me and saying, if you don't sign up today and you walk out of that door, you're going to be a loser for the rest of your life.
Wow. And so they were pressurizing you to sign up for training and everything, right?
They were. So I walked away and I went back, and I remember leaning against the radiator in the kitchen and saying to my wife, well, that's it. I'm out of property. She said, really? I said, clearly it's full of sharks and I don't like swimming in shark tanks.
Yes.
That was just a perception. I got the first impression. It was a bad first impression.
Yes.
And then I ended up getting a call from my accountant. My accountant said a couple of months later, Paul, you're still interested in property. We've got a guy who's doing a bit of a presentation on property. I went along to that. Totally different, ethical, really, is exactly what I wanted to hear.
Yes.
So I bought into the program. And I was probably a couple of months into the program, 3 months into the program maybe. And of course, at that time, Sarge, as well, you'll remember, everybody was doing back-to-back same-day remortgage.
Yes.
So provided you had a pulse,
yeah,
you could just keep buying houses day after day, get your money out, recycle it.
So this is the concept for somebody who may not be familiar with this, is you're finding a property where you've got some discount on it, 15, 20%, something like that. And effectively you're taking a bridging loan out to purchase it at the full amount of money that you need to pay. And you're remortgaging it the same day to pay up the bridge and probably get some money out.
Absolutely.
As well. So you get a property for free and maybe some money out of it as well. And this was the hot strategy at the time that was just being repeated constantly. This is what everybody was doing at the time.
And of course, I think we'll come to that later, but it's very relevant as to when we're talking about portfolios, because of course it's the only way and is the way that the majority of landlords manage to acquire these big portfolios.
Because the debt was easy. It was easy to just keep buying.
It wasn't regulated.
Yeah.
It was easy to keep doing. You could keep churning it, and you could literally do it. Provided you could pay a set of legal fees, you could do it with no money.
Yes.
So this is what I had been educated to do. And there am I now getting all my ducks in line, getting ready to go. And Fannie Mae, credit crunch, the rug was pulled. And of course, all of a sudden, lending stopped.
Yes. So this style of borrowing just literally disappeared overnight.
And it's funny, isn't it? Because, we're talking about it now with the Reform Act. If I could have £1 for every time that something has come along that was going to completely destroy this industry,
yes,
I'd probably be very, very wealthy. I wouldn't need to be doing anything else. Yeah. There's always something, but guess what? Something always comes out of it. Something new always develops.
We're a creative bunch of property investors.
We are indeed. Yeah, we are indeed. So that was where I was. But what had happened, and serendipitous and all that kind of thing, because I'd been opened up to the idea of mindset, and I really started looking at mindset and wealth creation strategies. I had invested very heavily, for a reason I don't know why at the time, in a NLP wealth creation strategy with a master's degree in NLP, neuro linguistic programming. And of course, for anybody not familiar with that, it's all about working with patterns, language patterns, working with people in a way that you can communicate better in their style. So it's working out what their communication style is, trying to match and mirror that communication style, and using words that will help you really find out what it is that they're really thinking. Because we find this all the time. I know that you would have found this all the time. People give you what they want you to hear.
Yes.
You ask what their issue or their situation is. They give you their presenting problem when they first meet you. It takes a little bit more to be able to find out what their real issue is some of the time. And so I did that because I just felt it was a great thing to do and I enjoyed it. But I was spending a lot of time in London. So I went on the forum, and a guy in London very kindly gave me accommodation for the week. And he had a rack of every single property course that you could ever buy. He was the world's biggest shelf development expert. And he said to me, Paul, can I have this NLP course when you finished? And I'd like to record it and put it on my shelf with everything else, right? By the way, you can have anything you want.
Yeah.
Now, this was before the credit crunch. This was kind of in that period in between.
Right.
And I took a course from Australia, all about, because they've been doing this stuff in Australia, they've been doing it in America for years. We didn't have a need for it here, really.
And the reason for that was because finance was so easy. So there was no need to do anything creative on a kind of a more creative way to acquire property when you can just go and borrow the money from the bank and they give you pretty much all of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'd been learning all this stuff just because I'm really interested in it. And it kind of resonated as well with the mindset stuff I've been learning because obviously it's a little bit out there in some ways. So in order to be able to communicate that, get that across to people, it's not quite as straightforward as having something prescribed. So I was doing all this, and then when the credit crunch came along and everything was pulled, there I was in the ideal position with a lot of learned knowledge.
Yeah.
It wasn't experience at that stage, it was learned knowledge that I was very, very keen to put to the test. And that's when I started getting involved in creative strategies.
Right.
So it really was a lot by luck.
Yes.
And then I started working with somebody who'd been doing it in the UK, but they'd actually been doing it via learning. They'd actually got books from America.
Right.
And they were actually learning how the American system did it and then gone away and spoken to their UK lawyers and said, how can we adapt it?
Yes, because the concepts are different. The principles are the same to do the strategy, but the actual technicalities, the legal structure is very different.
Very different. And sometimes different from state to state as well. So it can be quite complex in America in that way. However, I started working with this chap. He'd already acquired a number of properties that way, and he had bought a course from a lady in the United States, in Michigan. And this lady had done over 1,000 lease options over 25 years. Probably one of the most experienced in the world in this way. And through buying the course, he received 2 tickets to her 4-day intensive in Michigan.
Yes.
He couldn't go.
Okay.
So guess who got the tickets? So I took my wife.
Yes.
We sat there. And of course, we were the only guys from the UK. So she made a beeline for us, and she wanted to sit down and have a chat with her. Why are you here? What are you here for? Got a little bit cheeky, asked if I could interview her. In the days before we had iPhones and all that. So it was a little old Sanyo, I think it was, and I sit there in the foyer of the Hilton Hotel with around 30 or 40 Americans all standing around. Well, I frightened out my life. I was like a rabbit in the headlights. And so that went well. And then I thought I'd get really cheeky, and I said, I don't suppose you consider being our guest and coming across the UK. And much to my absolute shock, she said, I'd love to. That would be fantastic. I'm getting a lot more hits from my website in the UK. And the following January, I picked her up from the airport, and we spent 2 weeks traveling around together, her husband, my wife, my business partner and his wife. And we traveled around the country, meeting solicitors, property investors, going to various different network meetings. And then we actually ran an event in London as well. Yeah. Could not have paid for it.
Yeah. The amount of knowledge, just being in that environment, learning from somebody like that, seeing how they are looking and approaching things, is invaluable.
Invaluable. And it all came about by serendipity, really.
Yes.
So that's how I got into it.
Yes.
And then, of course, I started doing more and more deals. I've done some individual deals. And then we did a few together, myself and my business partner.
Yes.
And then it was about 2011, 2012, something like that, we got offered our first portfolio.
Right.
And that was a whole different learning experience. You know, I mean, my original concept was that it's okay. I've done one.
Yes.
So this is just 1 times 10.
Yes.
Or what have you. Not realizing all the nuances, specific things that can happen, and the influences and the counter interdependency between everything that happens in portfolios. So that was a big learning curve. But at the same time, as you quite rightly said at the very beginning, it opened my eyes to this thing about, well, we can 10 times it.
Yes.
How long would it take me to buy or acquire these 10 properties in my portfolio if I were to do them one by one?
Yes.
And that's really how that really started coming about. And then we formed a company in 2015, which was purely and simply to acquire portfolios of properties specifically. Yes. And that's really when I got very, very focused on portfolios. My role was the initial role dealing with the landlord, going and looking at the properties, doing all of the initial negotiation, and then I would hand it across to my business partner for the onboarding.
Okay. So at the time, I don't think there was anybody else that can't think of that was doing anything similar. You're the only person who's looking at how to acquire portfolios of property using creative strategies rather than just straightforward purchases. And then, so some of those you would keep and some you'd broker on to sell to other people as well.
Yeah. The majority would keep, but then sometimes you'd find that you take a full portfolio. And this is the other beauty about controlling rather than buying. Now, if you came to me with a portfolio of 30 properties and you had 5 in the Northeast, 4 in London, 3 in Brighton, 2 in Cornwall, and 1 in Wales, or what have you, I've now got a very diverse portfolio. Now, I may not have the infrastructure, I may not have the agency network, I may not be equipped. It may actually be the reason that they're looking to move it on in the first place. So I don't take on somebody else's problem, right? Now, using the control element, I can literally cherry pick which of those are going to work for me, which areas, which of those may be strategically right, which may be demographically right. I can do all of those things. And then others, it could be that, let's say I had 3 in Leeds and I don't want Leeds, it's too far for me, it's not my market, well, I can package those up.
Yes.
And I have the right to assign those properties to somebody else for a fee.
Mm.
So I can package up mini portfolios, keep the bits I want to keep, and then move things around. It's a bit like moving chess pieces around a chessboard, is the way I look at it, really. And it allows me to qualify exactly what I want.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't mean that if I don't want them in Leeds, it doesn't mean they're bad deals.
Yes.
They have to be good deals, otherwise nobody's going to do them.
Yeah.
But given time, which is what we have, I call it joint venturing with time. I say, you know, what we're doing is when we're going into a creative deal is we are using time to allow us to build and generate our wealth.
Yeah.
Whether that be through improving the property, whether it be through using some of the cash flow, because we make all the cash flow, providing there's cash flow, that cash flow can be used to be re-injected into the property to help lift the value. So we're not just totally reliant then on capital values going up. And naturally, the capital value, because again, for anybody who doesn't realize it, one of the other beauties of this is that we lock in the price. So anything above that price is ours. So the difference between the price that we've agreed, which is probably going to be somewhere near the top of the market today, may not be the price in 5 years' time.
Yeah.
And the difference is mine exactly as if we bought it.
Yes. And I think that's that point is really key. Coming back to why would somebody do that? Why would a seller agree to something like that? Well, it's not that different from if they'd sold and walked away. That's the price that they would get. You're just deferring how they're going to get paid or the structure in terms of how that's going to work, depending on what they need and what their circumstances are.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so the business kind of grew with portfolios, building portfolios, helping other people do this as well. And we first met, it's probably 15 plus years ago.
Wow.
And
frightening.
You were one of my early mentors that really helped me as well. And you're probably unaware of this, but one thing that really stuck in my mind that I learned from you, or the mistake I was making at the time when I'd learned this concept of creative strategies, I'd go and do verbal diarrhea to the investors, to the sellers, and try and explain all these concepts. We can do this, and this. And I was talking at them rather than trying to understand them. And something I really learned from you was the questioning, the techniques, how to ask questions, how to ask better questions, how things are framed, and the language used. And that really was a game changer for me. When I started shutting up more and listening a little bit more rather than just talking at the sellers, that's when things really became like gangbusters for me in terms of doing these more creative deals. So that massively helped. So you've kind of talked about the concept, the idea of doing this on a small property. We started off with a £6 million portfolio. Unpack that one a little bit more for us.
Yeah, sure.
Kind of things
it's actually really quite current. So, you know, it's probably a good one to talk about. So, Landlord came to me via the internet, this one, originally, and said, look, I'm looking to sell my portfolio, 30 properties in the south. And he was very, very resolute. Price was absolutely key. Now, you'll find this all the time. And so it's really important to understand, and I always ask this question in terms of what's most important to people. Don't ever expect them to say, or very rarely will they say, well, it's not about price.
Yes. Because
they don't want to expose their soft underbelly. They'd always put on that shell and say, well, I want to get the very best price. And then you talk about speed and they'll say, well, look, as far as I'm concerned, I'm in no hurry. Very often they'll give you all of the signs to try to knock you off course so that you don't come along and say, no, that's absolutely fine. That's great because I'm in no hurry either, by the way. Right. So let's just have a chat. Let's just talk it through. And I think one of the things, you're absolutely right, is we haven't got to sell anything. All we've got to do is to help people understand options that they didn't even know were available to them in the first place, because they don't. Most people are very blinkered. Most estate agents are very blinkered. They all share this common view of the old way set back in the Magna Carta, that we buy property in this country. And it's trying to understand it. But instead of trying to sell a concept, because I've always found I'm a terrible salesman.
Mhm.
Right? I hate it. I hate selling. And I really mean that. I'm not just saying that. I hate
Yeah.
selling. I'm the guy that if I walk into a shop and someone walks up to me and says, "Good morning, can I help you?" No, thank you. No, thank you very much. And
Just
what
looking.
I'm saying is, just looking.
Yeah.
What I'm actually saying is, I'm a big boy.
Yeah.
I can make my own decisions. Thank you very much. When I need you, I'll call you.
Yes.
And when I call them, then I'm really grateful
Mhm.
for them for their help. So I need to call in their help.
Yes.
I don't want them pushing their help in my face. So I'm very relaxed about it. No, that's absolutely fine. Let's just have a chat. Let's just
Yeah.
talk through the options. And I will say to people at the very beginning, no, I have absolutely no idea at all what it is that's right for you, what it is that you need, what it is that's going to be best for you.
Yes.
Because sometimes I have people come and say, well, go on then, give me your pitch.
Mm.
Go on then, give me a pitch.
Yeah.
I say, I don't have a pitch. You don't have a pitch? No, I don't have a pitch. I said, no, I have absolutely no idea what's going to be right for you. So why would I want to pitch something? It might be wrong.
Yes.
What I'd be more than happy to do is to explore lots of different ways we might be able to help you.
Yes.
And then what I'd like you to do, please, is tell me which of those are not going to work.
Mm.
And then the analogy I use is and I'm a great one. When I was a kid, I still do this to a degree. If I've got slings and arrows coming at me, I imagine I'm in a little force field and they're all bouncing off, right? So I'm quite visual in that way. And I visualize taking people down a corridor. And in each of these doors is a different strategy. And I say, what we're going to do is we're going to walk down the corridor together and we're going to open this door and we're going to have a look inside here and we're going to unpack what's in this room.
Yes.
And then I'm going to talk to you about the upsides and the downsides. And then we're going to explore. And by the way, if that one's not right for you, please tell me, we'll shut that door. Sound like Larry Grayson now.
Yeah.
Well, we won't go back to that one,
Yeah.
and we'll move on to the next one. And what we do by doing that is help people make their own choices. So when they actually come back to me, we've gone through everything, and they say, well, actually, that's one I'd like to explore. And I say, sure, let's explore that one. And they've asked me. So then we can explore it and go along those lines. Now, by the way, that may not be a lease option. People have this perception that I go out talking, selling, doing lease options. I do not. Because if I did that, I wouldn't do many.
Yes.
And that's the reality.
You've been very restrictive of your approach if that's the approach you took.
Yeah. And I used to, when I was coaching, I used to say to people, I had coachees. And you know, back in the day when we go out and do the mentoring and spend a couple of days at somebody's houses. And I remember a number of years ago, going to a house and this guy said, I'm so glad I've got you. He said, you're the lease option guy. And I'm I'm going out there. I'm all PLO'd up.
Right.
And I said, PLO'd up? Is that even a thing? But what does that mean?
Yes.
Oh, I'm going out there to do PLOs. And I would urge anybody not to go out there to look to do PLOs, because what that does, it sets your mindset into trying to make something happen the way you want it to happen. Whereas if you actually let it develop and that conversation develop, if it's not a PLO, that's cool. Because I'm guessing that anybody watching this podcast will probably go to network meetings, right? And at network meetings, you have other people. If you go back to the original Napoleon Hill thing about, the mastermind concept, it's not about knowing everything.
Yes.
It's about knowing people in your mastermind group who can help you and may have 20 or 30 years experience in that field. So I'd always say, never be afraid to get the no. And if it's no to a lease option, that's not a failure.
Yes.
It just means it wasn't right. It just means that if you were going to do a lease option, you probably would have got 2 or 3 years down the road and then fallen out.
Yeah.
So you probably just swerved a bullet.
Yes. Yeah. That's a really interesting way of looking at it, rather than just going trying to find that. And when I look back at my journey and what I've done over the years, it's when that shift happened, rather than I'm just looking for this, rather than I'm just going to go have a conversation and just see where it goes. And then you start exploring what might be the right way, or the concept I'd use at the time, like a toolbox. What's in the toolbox? What can we open up to try and fix this particular problem here? Yeah. And that just changed things. That became much, much easier to the conversations. And sometimes when we're teaching other people on how to do conversation, how to approach people, and the kind of questions or objections that come up, or why they're going to tell you how much is left on their mortgage, because they'll say that's none of your business. I said, well, that's right, they will say that if that's how you say it and that's how you ask questions.
Precise.
But if it's done in a way in the conversation, it's relevant at that time, they will happily tell you, because they can see you're helping, trying to find a solution. You're trying to come up with a way of giving them what they want.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And I've always, exactly as you said, I think what we need to avoid is this point where we're bumping against each other like that. Because once that happens, it's very, very difficult to then overcome that.
Yes.
So it needs to be a collaborative thing where, we're shoulder to shoulder, working to see if we can find a solution.
Yes.
And by the way, that has to work for you, but it actually also has to work for me as well.
Yes.
So I'm very open about that, very beginning, very open about the fact that I have to make money. I remember, and I will come back to the big portfolio because I hadn't forgotten that's what we were talking about. But I remember one of my early conversations where I went round and I had this guy who just wanted to give me his keys. And I hadn't really gone into any detail, and he just wanted to give me his keys. Look, take them now.
Yes.
I hadn't got hesitance.
I had a couple of those situations, and I was in the position where I say, okay, thank you very much, and then realized that probably wasn't the smartest thing to do.
Well, this particular one, his girlfriend or partner was a little bit more savvy than he was, and she was shouting him down. What do you think you're doing? What do you think you're doing? And I remember actually getting to a point when I started talking to her, and I said, by the way, do you know how I make my money? And she said, no. And I told her, and she said, that makes sense now. It all sounded too good to be true. I expect that you'd be able to want to make money. So don't ever try and hide the fact you're trying to make money.
Yeah, you're not a charity. You're there trying to resolve someone's problem, but you're also, it needs to be commercially viable for you as well.
Yeah. So look, coming back to the bigger deal. So the guy had called me. He'd phoned around a number of BMV companies. He wasn't prepared even to take 10%. And he got lovely properties. He wanted to stand down. That was his reason. He self-managed everything.
Okay.
Right? I mean, the guy, absolutely fantastic guy. He's got everything in here. He knew everything about every property, like a computer.
Yes.
He got his van with about 60 keys all hanging up on racks and the keys. I just hope the van never gets stolen. But it was incredible.
Yeah.
And all of these properties were immaculate. And he was at a stage of his life in his late 50s where he just wanted to move on and enjoy what he's got. But he just did not want to take a discount. Now, he's got the option of trying to sell them all individually. Now, he's got a couple of blocks within that. So he's got a block of 10, a block of 11 within there. And he wanted to just hive off a little bit of an office space and parking space for him. And the rest of it, he was quite happy to move on. Now, his big thing, when I really went through all of this with him and I tackled the idea and I said, well, look, these are the different ways that we might be able to assist you. And I went through all of that. He made the choice. He said, I'd be more than happy to explore that structured acquisition strategy. How does it work?
Yes.
So that's when I go into a little bit more detail about how we're making our money down the road, or the buyer. In this case, because in this case, it wasn't going to be for me. I was brokering this and I was looking to sell it to somebody else. So, this is another thing that we do. We don't, now in the new business, we don't keep them all. We look brokering deals. So I said, look, this is something that could really, really work for you and work for the seller, for the buyer. Anyway, we looked at it now. His biggest thing was, and this is one of the barriers or potential barriers or the challenges that sometimes presents itself. You've got a landlord, they've got good cash flow, they've got a big asset. The first thing is the barrier we put in our own way, because we say to ourselves, why would they ever want to do that? And I think this is the biggest barrier that we can give ourselves. We get in our own way massively when it comes to this, because we don't know what it is that's important to them. Yes. But we assume that we do, because we've got a level of knowledge. We know what we can do with it. We're creative people. We're in property. We can see possibly things that someone who's been with that portfolio for the last 20 years can't see. They're like ants on the map. They can't see the picture. They're too close. We're standing back. We can see that we can change something here. We can add some value here. We can turn that into an essay. We could do whatever it may be. And so we need to remove ourselves from that. And once we do that, that's when we really sort of move on. I use a kind of a little analogy. I call it portfolio alchemy. It's a little talk that I do. And I say, well, with alchemy, we're looking for turning lead into gold.
Yes.
And I use the example that we look at that portfolio, this big one I'm talking about in the south, and I could have looked at that and said, wow, that is just a whole load of gold ingots all together. Why would he ever give me his gold?
Yes.
Why? But the reality is, for him, he was sitting there holding a lead weight. Now, to turn that lead into gold, it had to come to me.
Yeah.
So for him, he's holding it, it's lead. For me, it could be gold, but it doesn't become gold until we find a way of me taking it from him. And that is the mindset shift that I think really makes all the difference.
Yeah.
So with the deal, he was quite happy when he went through everything. He was quite happy to do a 5-year deal, 60 months on this. Obviously, it's not going to be 60 months on everything because there are varying different mortgage end terms. So you can't do a lease option to extend beyond the end of a mortgage. There were some other personal loans which had to be sorted out, and there were some other matters that needed to be sorted out as well.
That's an interesting point, that there's actually a lot of things to factor in. It's not just a few basic headline numbers.
No.
There's a lot that needs to be considered.
There's a lot that you have to factor in, and this is the point with it, because there is an interdependence and interrelationship between all of the properties and all of the owners. Because guess what? Not all of these properties are with the same owner. And some of the owners in some of the properties are demised. Right. So you've got a whole lot of other stuff you've really got to dig into.
Yes.
And then you've got to really, really work it all out. So even when doing the AML and working through the AML, that in itself was quite a task, because it's like following a trail.
Yes.
And you're going back, well, that property, I see that one there was owned by 3 people. Let me follow the AML trail on those 3 people. Oh, they've demised. So who's it with now? And then you've got to follow it all through probate and da-da-da-da.
Yeah.
So it's quite a lot of untangling to do sometimes. But, and here's the other thing. It's knowing when to do that and when not to do that.
Yeah.
Because we spoke to somebody about 6 months ago now who called up and said, got a portfolio I'm looking at. I think it's going to be a really, really good lease option. I've been doing all the valuations on it for 6 months. And I've been out and seen the properties, but I can't get it over the line. Can you help me? Spoke to the guy, 6 minutes. We both agreed there was no way that portfolio could ever work as a lease option. 6 minutes.
Yes.
They spent 6 months. How disappointed were they when I went back to them and said, I'm sorry, but
yes,
not going to work. So you've got to be able to qualify very quickly as well, whether it's going to work. This guy qualified. It worked. Everything was in line. His big concern, is quite common with landlords, if they've got a portfolio that's generating a very good cash flow, and they're going to hand that across to a buyer, and there is no legal structure that says they have to buy it. Because remember, with a structure like this, we're not doing an EDC, an exchange and delay completion in this case. We're actually doing a lease option. So they have the right but not the obligation.
Yes, it's like a right to buy. That's
the right
you're
to buy.
Acquiring, yes.
Yeah. And so the obvious question is, well, you're going to run my properties, and how do I know that they're going to go through and buy it?
Yes.
Because so very often what they're looking for is they're looking for a huge chunk of money up front, advanced equity or money up front. That's what they're looking for, because they want to know that somebody has got skin in the game.
Mm-hmm. You've got a really smart model that you use in terms of how you assess. As you said, there's lots of moving parts. What are the kind of key things somebody should be thinking about if they are looking at having this kind of conversation with a seller when they're doing something creative? What are the kind of key ideas that are important, do you think?
Well, I'm going to say the very first thing is make sure that you actually like and trust them.
Yes.
Because
it's a kind of long-term business relationship.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've said to people before, would you go into business with someone you don't like? Well, just because you can doesn't mean you need to, because if you just can't get on with that person, or you've got an underlying feeling or a sense that something isn't right, it probably isn't.
Yes.
So, save yourself a lot of trouble, and don't do it if you have a genuine reason. The other thing is financial stability. Now, obviously, if you're dealing with somebody who's clearly in a real mess, you've got to be very, very careful. We've been dealing with a portfolio quite recently where a couple of properties had actually been called in by the lenders.
Right.
And the owners weren't aware of it. So we've had to work around that and put solutions in place. But one of the other things to bear in mind is when you are dealing with a portfolio of properties, that all of these interdependencies, teeth in, mean that they have what they call an all monies clause or a cross consolidation collateralization clause.
Yeah.
Now, what that means is that if an owner defaults on one, well, then they can actually call in the loan on all.
Yes.
So consequently, I'm looking at things such as, do they have other properties with the same lender that aren't in the deal I'm doing?
Yeah.
Because if they were to fall behind on that one, I've got no control over that.
Yeah. It could spill over.
Yeah. And it doesn't matter how good my lease option agreements are and who they're written by and how powerful my second charges are or whatever I may have on title. The reality is that you're never going to be a first charge lender.
Yes.
They're always
most control.
They're always going to have control. You might be able to do a deal. There's a possibility you might be able to do a deal, but then you've got to be in a position to be able to buy it. They're not going to do a lease option with you for 5 years.
Yes.
You've got to be in a position to be able to say,
dump up the cash and to complete on it.
So I would say certainly in that order. I say make sure it's someone you like. Make sure that absolutely they're financially stable as best you can. I mean, what I would sometimes do is exchange credit reports.
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
Because I just want to see. I sometimes people can have an issue with a property, or they can have an issue with a lender. Life happens. Things get in the way sometimes. Is that a one-off?
Yeah.
Have they had a swerve ball? Have they had something happen in their life, a partner demise, leave them, business collapse, something like that? Or is it a perpetual habit? Are they running from month to month, falling behind with their bills and their credit cards? I wouldn't touch that with a barge pole, personally.
Yeah.
I wouldn't. And I would never, ever entertain taking on a deal like that and passing that to anyone else, because that's just like the blue touch paper. That's a problem waiting to happen.
Some of these things I've learned the hard way, where I think when I first started doing more creative deals, it just opened up a whole new way of being able to take on property. And there's so many we took on because you just could, as opposed to they were necessarily the best deals. Now, to be fair, many of those, we just sat through them over time and they just went up in value. So we did okay at them. But some of them, we probably didn't make very much money out of them. And there's one, in fact, it was a portfolio of 3 properties. It was 3 plus 1, the 3, meaning 4 in total. And that one backfired on me. Not completely, for the reasons that you just mentioned earlier as well. I didn't have a great feeling about the seller. In terms, we didn't quite see eye to eye, but I still thought actually we can make really good money on this. Let's do the deal. And there were other financial stuff going on in their background as well, which I didn't really consider at the time, which I really should have. And so all that led to it becoming a bit messy. 3 of those we assisted sale and sold them, so that was fine. But the one that I decided to keep and I put quite a bit of money into is the one that I ended up losing.
Had to be,
Yeah. So and these things can go wrong as well. And I think one learning I got from that is that you do really need really good contracts to make sure these things are done properly. And sometimes people talk about, I've just downloaded this document on the internet, I'll just get them to sign it. And I said, yeah, if it's a valuable deal and you really want to make sure that that's protected and safe, that's probably not the best way to do it.
No.
Use solicitors who understand this, who are familiar with the concepts, who can set up in the same way. Just like the taxation side, if you're making money, how you can do it in a way which will be tax friendly for you as well, in terms of the way you're doing these deals. So if somebody wants to understand these concepts more, learn a little bit more, what do you think is what should they be thinking about? Is it a case of being more open to how they have conversation with sellers? Is it maybe the marketing and how you look for deals? What sort of things do you think?
Well,
they should be
I
thinking
think
about?
the deals, the beauty of the deals, and the majority of the deals that have come my way, apart from those that come to me because I've been doing it a long time, so I get a lot of people come to me with deals, and we had quite a few through the internet with the old company, but the majority of deals seem to have come from normal approaches to normal landlords when somebody just asked that one question: do you have any other properties? Right?
Yes.
And then the landlord said, well, yes, I do. Now, that can sometimes, it's a great question to ask, but I have seen this before where we've had somebody who really hasn't got aspirations to buy or acquire a big portfolio. Maybe they've got a good job. Maybe property is going to be kind of their side thing. And then, of course, if I ask that question, supposing they say yes, then I've got a problem because I've now got to deal with something I don't really want. So that has been the first thing. Finding them is quite easy. There are so many landlords at the moment trying to get out of portfolios because of what's happening. What's happened, it's been a steady succession from when they first said, well, we're going to remove some of the allowances, and then Section 24 came in, and then that gradually hit home. And now, of course, as we move into the new act, with the new tenancy laws, I see that is really, at the moment, there are a lot of landlords who, I'm going to call them the traditional landlords, who don't go to necessarily keep themselves enlightened and go to property meetings. They perhaps go to the NRLA meeting once a quarter. Maybe they've heard about this. Maybe their letting agents says something about it. Maybe a lot of them don't actually use letting agents, so they don't even know. And I think there is going to be even more of an exodus as soon as the first fines start hitting home.
Some of those fines are going to be quite substantial.
They're going to be quite substantial because we know that central government has removed funding to local governments. We've got local councils going bankrupt all over the place. Where are they going to get their money from? Well, all of a sudden, someone comes along with an open checkbook and says, you can go out and get some £10,000 fines from some of these landlords. And I think when it starts, nothing is real until it hits the press, right? That's a reality in life. As soon as it hits the press, the awareness in the media, then all of a sudden there's this mad panic. It's why people buy houses at the top of the market, because they wait until it's been reported that house prices have boomed, and then they go in and buy them. It's exactly the same thing. So I think once we start getting some of these things, then of course, then we're going to get the PPI type guys who are going to be writing to tenanted properties saying, have you got damp? Have you got mold? Have you got landlords? They don't want that, and many of them want to get out. Now they need to hand it over to professionals who can actually bring it up to standard and do the right thing with it, because they haven't got the heart for it. They haven't got the time for it. They've had their money from it. They've had an easy life.
Yes. And I begin to see that many landlords are in the business 20, 25 years. They've gone through the initial pain of acquiring. Values have gone up significantly. They've made a fair amount of money. And then when the next wave of change comes, like we're talking about now, and there's been just change after change after change, that they're thinking, actually, maybe this is the straw that breaks the camel's back. Maybe it's time to get out. And solutions like this means that you can come up with a way that will work for them, and it can be profitable and viable for you as well, versus them just trying to sell property. Or like I'm a fan of vacant property. I don't like the idea of taking the property on with somebody else, tenants, because I know how thorough we are in terms of who we would vet and put into a property. And I'm thinking, and that's just maybe my obsessive nature. And I'm thinking, no, I want it vacant. But sometimes it's not easy to sell a property that's tenanted, get it vacant, and then sell. And a solution like this, where actually the whole portfolio goes into somebody else's hands, and the problems get resolved. And the looking at it.
Yes, you're spot on again, because it was funny enough. It was after I didn't do the deal on that property in the Midlands at first with the older couple that I came out thinking, I couldn't really help them. All I could do was give them some advice on how to work with an estate agent. So I thought, how about I bought an estate agency? Because I could then help them as well. I could get something for it, and I've got them in my funnel. Yeah. So I bought an estate agency, and I ran
about that.
So I run that for 5 years. And what I found, the biggest benefit of running the estate agency was that, of course, I go to estate agents' conferences where it was poacher turned gamekeeper.
Yeah.
So I would sit down at a table with agents, and I'd say, do you ever get any, do you get many investors in your agency? And they would openly share with me, oh, yeah, so what is it that attracts you to an investor? What makes you do a deal with an investor? Do you ever get anybody coming in talking about these kind of crazy option deals or creative deals? Oh, yeah. Well, have you ever done any of those? And I'd ask all these questions. One of the things that became very, very, very clear, and it's one of the things that I think so many people miss, is, and big landlords, by the way, Sarge, miss this until they try it. They go into an estate agent and they think, I've got 20 properties to sell. I'm going to walk in here and the agent is going to think all their Christmases have come at once. And they walk in the door. First thing they've got to realize is they're not dealing with a manager, they're dealing with a negotiator who is paid a commission based on the number of sales. High pressure. Every Monday, probably a meeting. How are you doing? How's everybody doing? Let's have a look at the ratios. And you go and sit down and say, I've got 20 properties. Now, how long is the average estate agency contract? 12 weeks? Yep, something like that on average. And if it doesn't work, by the way, I'll take it away. So now I've got 12 weeks potentially to sell 20 properties. I've got to go out and view 20 properties. I've got to take photographs of 20 properties. I've got to get floor plans. I've got to get EPCs. I've got to have a real job dealing with 20 sets of tenants, because I've now got to go and see them, but I've obviously got to allow them the time. I can't just march in. I've got to give them 24 hours notice. But then they're probably not all going to coordinate. Yes. Now, the tenants, they don't want it sold. So they're not necessarily going to be helpful when I get somebody phone up and say, yes, I'd like to come and view them all, please. I could be out of the office for the next 2 weeks dealing with this portfolio and not sell one property while everybody else in the office is doing all the deals, right? So the reality is agents do not, in the main, there will be exceptions, but in the main, they do not know how to handle portfolios. So where does the portfolio landlord go? He has to come to, and then he phones the we buy any house type scenario and gets offered 20% or 20%. Can't do that. And why can't he do that? Because, of course, many landlords over the years, they buy their properties, they wait for them to go up in value, they remortgage. They wait for them to go up, they remortgage. Now, they've had all that tax-free cash over all these years. And because it's debt, remortgage, more borrowing, it's debt. They've not paid any tax on it. And now they want to sell their portfolio, but they're still leveraged at 65, 70%. Yeah. So when someone comes along and says, I'm going to offer you 25% discount from market value, by the time you put capital gains tax in there, they're on a loss.
Yes, that could be quite a substantial tax bill that they need.
Could be a substantial tax bill they've got to pay. So if we can then potentially float a solution that might allow them to mitigate some of that, we're never going to remove it, but if we can mitigate some of that, and it's not as good as it used to be because obviously, its allowances have reduced. I mean, when it was sort of 12 and a half per person, and you could do that over 5 years.
A couple,
20 odd grand a year, that was very substantial, but it's still worth doing. It's still worth doing. And of course, it also means that it allows them to get that top market value. So I've sat there with people using our system, and I had everything on a laptop in their home with them on our system, and I'm going through a portfolio with them, and I'm saying, right, let's have a look at this one here. Right, okay, that's got plenty of equity. What would you like to do with that one? I would like to sell that one. Okay, we'd like to sell that one for you. Right, we'll sell that on the open market. That one there, oh no, that hasn't got a great deal. No, let's do a lease option on that one. Okay, tick, next, tick, next, tick.
Yes.
You're telling me?
Yes.
I'm not telling
At
it.
a micro level, rather than just trying to take a holistic view of we're just going to do X with the whole thing. Yeah. You find the solution for each component.
Each component, yeah. And it may be that we'll blend. It may be that we'll have a blended solution where we move some out. We may put some into certain other portfolios. We might be able to blend it, moving all around. And that's what I love about it. That's the that is the magic.
Yes.
Where you can actually create something from something which actually looks to be a problem. And trying to find that magic is really where I get my kick.
Paul, this is by far my favourite topic when it comes to creative deals. We could spend all day talking about it. Somebody wants to reach out to you, connect to you. What's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, best way is to put inquiry on the website. You can go have a look at the website. So it's www.portfoliosalesconsultancy.co.uk. And then effectively, that can work from all different angles. But if somebody finds a portfolio they're happy to do themselves, go ahead and do it. But just make sure that you're covering all of your bases. Make sure that you're not going to spend 6 months on something which isn't going to work for you, because that's I actually had a student once who actually spent a year, nearly their whole learning year, on one portfolio, nothing else in the pipe, because they put so much into it and it all went wrong. And it can do. I've had it.
Yes.
I've had it. I had a deal I'd spent 9 months on it. I'd made multiple visits. It was a guy who had 10 big HMOs right opposite Wimbledon, the tennis academy. And he used to have a feeder academy that went in there. So he bought all these properties. He rented them all out to tennis professionals who were training with him, and then fed them into Wimbledon.
Okay.
And he sold his tennis academy, and I did a deal on all 10 of the properties. I met him, I met his wife, I met his kids. We had everything together. 10 lots of legal contracts. Now, fortunately, in our company, one of our co-directors was actually a lease option lawyer.
Okay.
Right? So fortunately, it didn't cost me. But that could have cost me 10 contracts, 20 odd grand.
Yeah.
Got to day of exchange, and the morning of the exchange, his accountant, who he'd known for 25 years, family accountant, got cold feet and said, you know what, I don't think we ought to do this. And he didn't do it. So you never can, the deal is never done till the deal is done.
Yes.
So just be careful.
Paul, a fountain of knowledge, lots of wisdom there. Thank you so much for sharing.
Pleasure.
We'll
Absolute pleasure.
On the screen and also in the description below as well. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thanks, Sergeant.